Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, October 1943. Lorraine Ashcroft stood in the dimly lit laboratory of Mercy Hospital's pathology wing, staring at something that shouldn't exist. The spectral lines on the emission spectrograph showed the unmistakable signature of thallium sulfate, a rat poison that didn't appear in food by accident. A poison that killed slowly, invisibly, leaving behind a trail of symptoms that mimicked ordinary aging or chronic illness. Lorraine lifted her eyes from the instrument and looked out the window. Beyond the glass, the lights of wartime Pittsburgh glowed against the autumn evening, factories running double shifts to supply the war effort. 4 miles from this hospital, in a weathered Victorian house on Denniston Avenue, her father Wendell sat down to his evening meal, and his young wife Vera was pouring his coffee. That same coffee whose sample Lorraine had taken this morning when Vera stepped out to collect the mail. That same coffee in which thallium now glowed under laboratory analysis. The 26-year-old medical technologist understood with cold certainty her father was being murdered. And his killer was the woman who had vowed to love him. The story began 3 years earlier, in November 1940. Wendell Ashcroft, a professor of pathology and head of the anatomical sciences department at the University of Pittsburgh Medical School, had become a widower that September. His wife Dorothy had died of pancreatic cancer after 18 months of deterioration. She was 51. Wendell was 56. They had 2 children, a son, Clayton, 28 years old, a cardiologist at Allegheny General Hospital, and a daughter, Lorraine, 23, who had just completed her medical technology degree and taken a position as a laboratory technologist at the Clinical Research Institute. Wendell took Dorothy's death hard. They'd been married 30 years. He withdrew from social life, stopped attending the symphony concerts at Syria Mosque that he'd loved, spent all his time either at the medical school or at home, surrounded by pathology journals and the manuscript of his unfinished textbook on tumor cell morphology. Clayton and Lorraine lived independently. The son rented an apartment near the hospital. The daughter had found a room in a boarding house through the university housing office. But both visited their father regularly, usually on Sunday afternoons. Wendell prepared simple meals that Dorothy had taught him to cook, doing enough on weekends to last the week, and it seemed he would live this way until retirement, alone, absorbed in research, sustained by memories of Dorothy. But in November 1940, at a medical conference where Wendell presented a paper on adenocarcinoma pathology, a woman approached him. Vera Kowalski, 30 years old, a registered nurse from the outpatient clinic at Presbyterian Hospital, who said she'd admired his published research since her nursing school days. She was petite and trim, with ash-blonde hair pulled into a professional bun and attentive gray eyes. She spoke softly, with traces of a Pittsburgh working-class accent. Wendell, flattered by her interest, engaged in conversation. Vera explained that she'd been widowed 2 years before. Her husband had died of a factory accident at 38, crushed between rail cars at the Jones and Laughlin steel mill. They'd had no children. She lived alone in a small apartment in Lawrenceville, worked extra shifts to make ends meet, dreamed of someday continuing her education to become a physician, but lacked the time and money. They encountered each other again a week later, apparently by chance in the medical library. Then Vera telephoned Wendell at his office, asking advice about a journal article on wound care. He invited her for coffee at the medical school cafeteria. The meetings became regular. By the end of December 1940, Wendell had, to his colleague's surprise, seemed to shed years. He smiled again, bought a new suit despite wartime rationing, even got a modern haircut. In February 1941, he informed his children he was getting remarried. Clayton and Lorraine received this news with reservation. Not because they begrudged their father happiness, it simply seemed precipitous. Mother had died only 6 months ago, but Wendell looked genuinely happy for the first time since the funeral, and the children decided not to object. Vera, when they met her, made a favorable impression, modest, quiet, clearly devoted to the professor. She spoke of how she revered Wendell, how she'd always dreamed of an educated, cultured husband. Clayton murmured to his sister afterward, ___, quote __, 0 ___. Lorraine agreed, though something indefinable troubled her, a vague unease she couldn't articulate. The wedding was modest, held in March 1941 at the Shadyside Presbyterian Church. Vera moved into Wendell's house on Denniston Avenue, a three-story Victorian with book-lined study, formal parlor, and the upright piano Dorothy had played. The first months went smoothly. Vera quit her hospital position, saying she wanted to devote herself to home and husband. She cooked, cleaned, attended to Wendell's needs. When Clayton and Lorraine visited on Sunday afternoons, the house smelled of baking and gleamed with cleanliness. Vera was cordial but maintained appropriate distance. She didn't try to replace their mother, which the children appreciated. She addressed them formally as Quote 1 and Quote 2, though she was only 2 years older than Clayton and 7 years older than Lorraine. But by summer 1941, Lorraine began noticing changes in her father. Wendell complained of fatigue. He mentioned sleeping poorly, suffering headaches, experiencing memory lapses. Vera attributed this to his age and work stress. She brewed herbal teas for him, administered vitamins, insisted he take __quote _3 __. She purchased at McKesson's pharmacy. Wendell dutifully consumed whatever his wife provided. He told his children, "Vera takes such good care of me. I'd be lost without her." By autumn 1941, just after Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, the situation had worsened. Wendell began looking older than his years. His hair thinned dramatically, his complexion turned ashen, dark circles appeared beneath his eyes. He complained of joint pain, numbness in his extremities, persistent weakness. Clayton, as a physician, grew concerned and suggested comprehensive medical evaluation. But Vera intervened. She said Wendell was already under the care of an excellent internist, a colleague from her previous hospital work, who had prescribed a treatment regimen. Which internist she didn't specify. Clayton asked to review the treatment plan. Vera replied that all documentation remained with the doctor's office. Nothing was kept at home. This alarmed Clayton, but he chose not to press the issue, avoiding conflict with his stepmother. In January 1942, Wendell collapsed with severe abdominal pain. Vera called an ambulance. He was hospitalized with suspected acute pancreatitis. He spent 2 weeks at Mercy Hospital while physicians ran tests that revealed inflammation but no definitive cause. They treated symptoms, discharged him with dietary restrictions. At home, Vera assumed complete control of his care. She prepared all his meals separately, insisted he avoid rich foods, administered her teas and medicines. Wendell visibly deteriorated. By spring 1942, he could barely walk without a cane, rarely left the house, took medical leave from the university. Clayton attempted private conversations with his father, but Vera was omnipresent, always bringing tea, administering medication, or announcing Wendell needed rest. Once, when Clayton finally caught his father alone momentarily, he asked directly, "Dad, what exactly is Vera giving you? I'm a doctor. I can evaluate whether the treatment is appropriate." Wendell waved dismissively. "Son, your stepmother is an experienced nurse. She knows what I need. Don't trouble her." Clayton realized his father was completely under Vera's influence. He discussed this with Lorraine, said something had to be done, but neither knew what action to take. Then, in February 1943, Clayton died. It happened without warning. Clayton had been working in the cardiology department, felt fine, was healthy and vigorous. He was 31 years old. On February 22nd, evening, he returned home after a hospital shift, ate dinner, went to bed. The next morning, his landlady found him. The apartment door was unlocked. Clayton lay on the floor near the bathroom. The ambulance crew pronounced him dead. Preliminary assessment: acute heart failure. The autopsy conducted the following day confirmed it. Cardiac arrest, massive myocardial necrosis. The pathologists were baffled. A young, healthy man, athletic, didn't smoke, didn't drink excessively. These things happen occasionally, they said, hidden pathology impossible to predict. Wendell couldn't endure his son's funeral. He wept at the graveside, leaning on his cane, barely able to stand. Vera supported him, offered comfort, administered __quote_8__ drops. After the burial, Wendell became bedridden. He rarely rose, became delirious at night, called for Dorothy and Clayton. Vera told Lorraine she'd summoned a physician, that Wendell had been prescribed strong sedatives, that he needed time to recover mentally. Lorraine was alone now. Mother dead 3 years ago, brother 2 weeks ago, father dying. And Lorraine suddenly felt it, something terribly, hideously wrong with everything that had happened. She remembered how rapidly her father had aged after marrying Vera, how Vera controlled every meal, every medication, how Clayton had tried to discover what their stepmother was administering but never succeeded, how a young, healthy man had suddenly died, heart failure, without precedent. Lorraine was a medical technologist specializing in clinical chemistry and toxicology. She knew poisons existed that killed slowly, invisibly, mimicking natural disease. The thought was monstrous, incredible, but it lodged in her mind and wouldn't release. The next Sunday, Lorraine visited her father. Vera greeted her at the door, pleasant as always. __quote_9__ Wendell was in bed, propped on pillows, looking skeletal. His hands trembled, his eyes were unfocused. He seemed to recognize Lorraine but couldn't sustain conversation. Vera hovered, bringing water, adjusting blankets. At one point, she excused herself. "I need to use the lavatory. Stay with him, won't you?" The moment Vera left the room, Lorraine acted on impulse. On the bedside table stood a carafe of water and a medicine cup containing dark liquid. Tonic, Vera had called it. Lorraine pulled a small glass vial from her purse. She'd brought it deliberately, not knowing if she'd have opportunity to use it. She poured a sample of the liquid into the vial, capped it, concealed it in her handbag. Her heart hammered. When Vera returned moments later, Lorraine was sitting calmly beside her father's bed. The following morning, Lorraine arrived at the Clinical Research Institute laboratory at 7 o'clock, before her colleagues. She ran the sample through standard toxicological screening, tests for barbiturates, opiates, common poisons. Nothing abnormal appeared. But Lorraine knew from her training that certain poisons required specialized detection methods. She consulted a reference text on industrial toxins and noticed something. Thallium sulfate, used in rat poison and depilatories, produced symptoms matching her father's condition: hair loss, peripheral neuropathy, gastrointestinal distress, neurological impairment. Detection required emission spectrography. The institute had a spectroscope, used primarily for mineral analysis in metabolic research. Lorraine had been trained on it. She prepared the sample according to protocol, ran the analysis. The spectral lines appeared immediately. Thallium, unmistakable. Lorraine stood frozen, staring at the readout. Her father was being poisoned. Methodically, deliberately poisoned. Her next thought? Clayton. Had he been poisoned too? But he'd been autopsied. Surely they would have found something. Unless they hadn't looked for thallium specifically. Standard autopsy protocols in 1943 didn't screen for obscure industrial poisons. If the pathologist expected heart failure, that's what they'd confirm. Tissue samples from Clayton's autopsy would have been preserved, standard procedure. If she could obtain them, test them. But how? She was a laboratory technologist, not a physician, not a law enforcement official. She had no authority to access autopsy materials. And if she went to the police with her suspicions based on one sample of questionable provenance, what credibility would she have? A grieving daughter accusing her stepmother of murder based on unauthorized laboratory work? Lorraine needed more evidence. She needed to document a pattern. Over the following weeks, Lorraine visited her father twice weekly, always on different days to avoid establishing routine. Each visit, when opportunity arose, when Vera left the room momentarily, Lorraine collected samples. A spoonful of the __quote_12__ Vera administered. A sample from his water glass. A bit of the special tea Vera brewed. She sealed each sample in labeled vials, noting date and source. In the laboratory, working early mornings and late evenings when colleagues weren't present, Lorraine analyzed each sample. Thallium appeared in every one. The concentrations varied, sometimes low, sometimes higher, but the poison was consistent. Lorraine began researching thallium toxicology. She learned it had been developed as a rodenticide in the 1920s, but was also used in depilatory creams sold commercially. It was tasteless, odorless, soluble in water. Small doses administered regularly would produce chronic toxicity that mimicked various diseases. Victims suffered hair loss, nerve damage, confusion, gastrointestinal problems. Death could take months or years depending on dosage. And crucially, it was nearly impossible to detect without specific testing. Lorraine also researched Vera's background. She visited the administrative office at Presbyterian Hospital, claiming to be verifying employment references for a nursing position application. The records clerk, a friendly older woman, confirmed Vera Kowalski had worked there from 1936 to 1941. 2 husbands? Lorraine kept her expression neutral. Lorraine thanked the clerk and left, her mind racing. Vera had been widowed twice before marrying Wendell? She'd told the family about the second husband, the steel mill accident, but she'd never mentioned a first marriage. Lorraine spent the next week at the Carnegie Library, searching through newspaper archives. She found the obituary, __quote_16__. No cause of death listed. Then she found the second obituary, __quote_17__. So Vera had married 2 different men named Kowalski, both of whom died young. The first, quote 18. The second in a workplace accident that could have been investigated as just that, an accident. Had both been murdered? Or was Lorraine's grief-stricken mind conjuring conspiracies from coincidence? Lorraine needed to know about the first husband's death. She went to the Allegheny County Coroner's Office, a grim building downtown, and requested to see death certificates. The clerk, a bored, middle-aged man, pulled the file for Walter Kowalski. Cause of death: acute gastroenteritis and cardiac failure. No autopsy performed. The attending physician had attributed death to natural causes, likely food poisoning. Lorraine felt ice in her veins. Acute gastroenteritis, severe gastrointestinal distress, was a hallmark of thallium poisoning. And if no autopsy had been performed, no one would have looked for poison. She needed to speak with someone knowledgeable about criminal poisoning. But who? The police would dismiss her as hysterical. She needed an expert, someone who would take her seriously. Lorraine remembered Professor Gerald Hutchins, who taught forensic pathology at the medical school and consulted for the county coroner's office. He'd lectured to her medical technology class on toxicological analysis. He was methodical, rational, respected. If anyone would listen, it would be him. She telephoned Professor Hutchins's office, identified herself as a former student, requested a meeting regarding __quote_20__. He agreed to see her the next afternoon. In Hutchins's cluttered office, surrounded by anatomical models and jars of preserved specimens, Lorraine presented her case. She showed her documentation, the sample analysis results, the dates, the thallium concentrations. She explained her father's symptoms, his progressive deterioration, Vera's control over his medication and diet. She described her brother's sudden death and her suspicion that he too had been poisoned. She presented the information about Vera's 2 previous husbands, both dead young. Professor Hutchins listened without interruption, examining the spectroscopy reports. When Lorraine finished, he removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Miss Ashcroft, this is deeply troubling. The laboratory evidence is compelling. Thallium poisoning is rare but well documented. The symptoms you describe are consistent, and the pattern, 3 husbands, all experiencing health crises or sudden death. He paused. But you understand, this evidence is circumstantial. You obtained these samples without authorization. In a court of law, the defense would argue contamination, mishandling, improper chain of custody. "I know," Lorraine said, "but my father is dying. If I'm right, he has weeks, maybe days. I need to stop her." Hutchins considered. "If you file a complaint with police, they'll investigate. But investigations take time. And if Mrs. Ashcroft is guilty, she'll cease administering the poison once she knows she's suspected. Your father might survive, but proving attempted murder becomes much harder. The evidence dissipates. Then what do I do? You need contemporaneous medical documentation. Get your father hospitalized immediately, under credible pretense. Once he's in hospital care, away from his wife's access, his condition should stabilize if thallium poisoning is the cause. Meanwhile, physicians can conduct proper toxicological testing. If thallium is confirmed in his system, that's medical evidence properly documented. That, combined with your laboratory findings, your brother's suspicious death, and the history of previous husbands, that might convince a district attorney to pursue charges. But how do I get him hospitalized? Vera won't allow it. You're his daughter. You have standing to request emergency psychiatric evaluation if you believe he's a danger to himself due to mental incapacity. Given his recent bereavement and his apparent confusion, which might be thallium-induced delirium, a judge could authorize involuntary commitment for observation. It's aggressive, but it gets him away from his wife's care immediately. Lorraine felt queasy at the idea of having her father committed, even temporarily. But it might save his life. There's another matter, Hutchins continued. Your brother. If he was poisoned, the evidence is in his preserved tissues. Autopsy specimens are kept for years. I can request those samples for retrospective analysis, citing academic research purposes. If thallium is found, that transforms this from suspicion to confirmation of homicide. How long would that take? Days for the tissue retrieval, perhaps a week for analysis. Miss Ashcroft, I want to be clear. I'm not promising anything. But if your suspicions are correct, we may be dealing with a serial killer. That makes intervention imperative, regardless of procedural complications. Lorraine left Hutchins's office with a plan. The next morning, she went to the county courthouse and filed a petition for emergency psychiatric evaluation of her father, citing his incoherence, his inability to care for himself, and her concern that he might harm himself in his confused state. She felt like a traitor, but she knew it was necessary. The judge, an elderly man who reviewed such petitions routinely, granted the order. That afternoon, 2 sheriff's deputies and a county physician arrived at Wendell's house on Denniston Avenue. Vera answered the door, alarmed. __quote _34 __. The physician explained. There was a court order for psychiatric evaluation. Wendell would be transported to Mayview State Hospital for observation. Standard duration, 72 hours. Vera's composure cracked. This is absurd. My husband is grieving, not insane. Who requested this? The petition was filed by his daughter, Lorraine Ashcroft. Vera's gray eyes turned to ice. __quote _37 __. But she had no legal recourse. The deputies entered, found Wendell in bed, explained gently that he needed to come with them. Wendell, barely comprehending, was dressed and escorted to the ambulance. Vera followed to the door, protesting, but was not permitted to accompany him. At Mayview Hospital, Wendell was admitted to the medical observation ward. The attending psychiatrist, Dr. Millard Voss, had been briefed by Professor Hutchins. The two had trained together. Voss understood this was not primarily a psychiatric case. He ordered comprehensive blood work, including toxicological screening with specific instruction to test for thallium. The results came back 36 hours later. Thallium detected in blood serum at toxic levels. Voss immediately contacted Professor Hutchins, who contacted Lorraine, who contacted the district attorney's office. Assistant District Attorney Robert Fendrick was assigned the case. He was young, ambitious, a naval veteran who'd been discharged due to chronic asthma and returned to civilian law practice. He reviewed the evidence. Lorraine's laboratory analyses, the hospital blood tests, the history of Vera's previous husbands, Clayton's autopsy scheduled for tissue reanalysis. "This is strong," he admitted, "but we need to move carefully. If we arrest Mrs. Ashcroft prematurely and can't prove the case, she walks. I want the tissue analysis from the brother completed. I want confirmation that the previous husbands also died under suspicious circumstances. And I want to search the Ashcroft residence for thallium-containing substances." "How long will that take?" Lorraine asked. "A week, maybe 2. Meanwhile, your father stays hospitalized. As long as he's away from his wife, he's safe." The wait was agonizing. Wendell remained at Mayview Hospital, his condition gradually stabilizing as the thallium cleared from his system. His confusion lessened. His strength slowly returned. He asked for Vera. The staff told him she couldn't visit during the evaluation period. He accepted this passively, too weak to protest. Professor Hutchins completed the tissue analysis on Clayton's preserved autopsy specimens. The results confirmed thallium in heart muscle, liver, and kidney tissue, concentrations consistent with acute poisoning administered shortly before death. ADA Fendrick's investigator looked into Vera's first husband, Walter Kowalski. He tracked down the attending physician who'd signed the death certificate, now retired, living in Wilkinsburg. The old doctor remembered the case. __quote_42__. The investigator also located Walter Kowalski's brother, Eugene, who worked at a foundry in Braddock. Eugene was bitter. "I never trusted Vera. Walter married her after knowing her 3 months, met her at a church social. She seemed sweet, but something was off. Walter got sick 6 months after the wedding. Doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. Then he died. Vera inherited everything. Not much, but Walter had a life insurance policy through the foundry, $5,000. She collected it and moved away. I wanted an investigation, but the police said there was no evidence of foul play." Martin Kowalski, the second husband, was harder to trace. He'd left no surviving family. But factory records showed the __quote_44__ occurred when he fell from a catwalk onto rail tracks during his shift. Co-workers interviewed at the time reported Martin had been dizzy and disoriented that week, complaining of vision problems. One supervisor noted, quote 45, "Vision problems and loss of balance were symptoms of thallium poisoning affecting the nervous system." Fendrick now had enough for an arrest warrant. On March 15, 1943, detectives arrived at the Denniston Avenue house and took Vera Kowalski Ashcroft into custody on charges of attempted murder and suspicion of homicide. They searched the house thoroughly. In a locked cupboard in the basement, they found a bottle of Coremlu depilatory cream, which contained thallium acetate. They found a pharmacy receipt for rat poison, Zelio paste, thallium sulfate. And in a hat box in Vera's closet, they found documents, life insurance policies on Wendell Ashcroft and Clayton Ashcroft, both taken out within months of Vera's marriage to Wendell, both naming Vera as beneficiary. Wendell's policy? $20,000. Clayton's policy? $10,000. Vera had insured her stepson's life and then poisoned him. The trial began in September 1943. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. The toxicology reports, the insurance policies, the suspicious deaths of previous husbands, expert testimony from Professor Hutchins on thallium poisoning, and Wendell's dramatic recovery once removed from Vera's care. Vera's defense attorney argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that Lorraine had tampered with samples, that the previous husband's deaths were coincidental. But the jury didn't buy it. The prosecution's case was too thorough, too compelling. Wendell, recovered enough to testify, took the stand. He described how Vera had controlled his diet, administered tonics, insisted he take her medicines. He wept as he recounted trusting her completely, loving her, believing she was caring for him. "I thought she was my angel," he said quietly. "She was my executioner." The jury deliberated 4 hours. Guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Clayton Ashcroft. guilty of attempted murder of Wendell Ashcroft. The judge sentenced Vera to life imprisonment at the State Correctional Institution at Muncie. As the bailiffs led her away, Vera looked directly at Lorraine and smiled. A cold, empty smile that sent chills through the courtroom. After the trial, Lorraine visited her father at his house. He'd returned home, but the place felt haunted. He was considering selling it, moving somewhere without memories. Quote 49, quote, he said. Quote 50, quote. Lorraine had no answer. She'd been researching serial poisoners, trying to understand. She'd learned about other cases, women who killed husbands for insurance money, using arsenic, antimony, thallium. The quote 51 they were called. Vera fit the pattern. Charming, patient, methodical. She'd refined her technique over 3 victims, learned to avoid suspicion, to mimic natural death. But Lorraine had stopped her. And in doing so, she realized she discovered something important. A systematic approach to detecting chronic poisoning that could save other lives. Over the next year, while continuing her work at the Clinical Research Institute, Lorraine compiled her findings into a scientific paper. She documented the clinical presentation of chronic thallium poisoning, the laboratory detection methods, the differential diagnosis distinguishing it from other conditions. She included case studies, her father, her brother, the previous husbands. She titled it quote 52 She submitted the paper to the Journal of the American Medical Association. It was accepted and published in March 1944, the first comprehensive American study of thallium poisoning in a domestic homicide context. The paper gained immediate attention. Medical examiners across the country began incorporating thallium screening into suspicious death investigations. Several cases were solved as a result. Wives and husbands who'd been slowly poisoning spouses, undetected until Lorraine's work provided the diagnostic framework. Lorraine herself became a consultant to law enforcement on poisoning cases. She developed training protocols for toxicology laboratories, taught courses on forensic chemistry. Her work expanded beyond thallium to other obscure poisons, antimony, selenium, phosphorus compounds. In 1946, she was invited to join the faculty at the University of Pittsburgh Medical School as an instructor in toxicology, becoming one of the first women appointed to a teaching position in the Department of Pathology. She accepted, while maintaining her laboratory work at the Clinical Research Institute, splitting her time between teaching and research. Over the following years, Lorraine pursued graduate studies while working, earning her Ph.D. in biochemistry from the University of Pittsburgh in 1951. Her dissertation expanded on her earlier work, developing improved methods for detecting multiple metallic poisons in biological samples. She was promoted to assistant professor in 1952, associate professor in 1958, and full professor in 1964. Wendell Ashcroft recovered fully from the poisoning. He returned to teaching, completed his textbook on tumor pathology, retired in 1948 at age 64. He never remarried. He lived alone in a smaller house in Squirrel Hill, close to Lorraine's apartment. They had dinner together twice a week, an unspoken understanding between them. They'd survived something terrible together, and that bond was unbreakable. He died peacefully in 1950, at age 66, of a cerebral hemorrhage. At the funeral, Lorraine delivered the eulogy. She spoke of his brilliance as a teacher, his dedication to pathology, his kindness. She didn't mention Vera. That chapter was closed. But at the grave, standing beside Clayton's headstone, her brother, murdered at 31, Lorraine made a private vow. She would continue her work. She would ensure that other poisoners were caught, other victims saved. Evil had touched her family, but she would transform that evil into knowledge, that knowledge into protection for others. She kept that vow for 44 years. Lorraine Ashcroft never married. She devoted herself to her work with single-minded intensity. She published 23 papers on toxicology, trained hundreds of laboratory technologists and graduate students, consulted on over 200 criminal cases. She became the foremost authority on domestic poisoning in the United States. In 1963, she was invited to testify before Congress on the regulation of toxic substances in household products. Her testimony led to stricter controls on thallium-based rat poisons and depilatories, making them harder to obtain and reducing poisoning deaths significantly. In 1972, she received the American Academy of Forensic Sciences Distinguished Fellow Award. In her acceptance speech, she said, "Science is not neutral. Science is a tool, and tools can be used for good or evil. A poisoner uses chemistry to kill. A toxicologist uses chemistry to save lives and catch killers. We have a moral obligation to ensure our knowledge serves justice." Vera Kowalski-Ashcroft remained in prison at Muncie until her death in 1968, at age 58, from uterine cancer. She never admitted guilt, never expressed remorse. In interviews with criminologists studying female serial killers, she maintained her innocence, claimed she'd been framed by a jealous stepdaughter. The evidence against her was overwhelming, but she never wavered from her denials. One psychiatrist who interviewed her wrote, __quote_54__. Lorraine read that evaluation and felt a cold recognition. That was exactly what Vera had been, a predator who saw people as prey. And if Lorraine hadn't stopped her, Vera would have continued killing. After Wendell, there would have been a fourth husband, a fifth, a sixth. Each one insured, each one slowly poisoned, each death attributed to natural causes. But Lorraine had stopped her. A 26-year-old laboratory technologist, armed with scientific training and moral courage, had broken the pattern. She trusted her instincts, gathered evidence, built a case that no jury could ignore. She'd saved her father and prevented future murders, and crucially, she'd transformed her personal tragedy into scientific knowledge that protected others. Her paper on thallium poisoning became required reading in medical schools. Her detection protocols became standard practice in toxicology labs. Her testimony helped change laws. In 1976, Lorraine published her comprehensive textbook, __quote_55____, which synthesized decades of research and casework into a practical guide for pathologists, toxicologists, and criminal investigators. The book went through 4 editions and remained the standard reference work in the field for over 3 decades. In 1985, Lorraine was diagnosed with lung cancer. She'd never smoked, but decades of working with chemical reagents in poorly ventilated laboratories had taken their toll. She underwent treatment but refused to retire, continuing to work through chemotherapy, determined to finish training her successor and complete the 4th edition of her textbook. She died in 1987, at age 70, at her home in Oakland, surrounded by colleagues and former students. She'd outlived her father by 37 years, her brother by 44. She'd used those years well. Her obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette called her a pioneer in forensic toxicology whose work saved countless lives. The American Chemical Society published a memorial tribute. Dr. Ashcroft turned personal tragedy into scientific triumph, demonstrating that rigorous methodology and moral conviction can together serve justice. At her funeral, Professor Gerald Hutchins, now in his 80s, retired but still sharp, delivered a remembrance. Lorraine Ashcroft was my student, my colleague, my friend. She came to me in 1943 with an impossible problem. Proved that her father was being poisoned when all conventional evidence said he was simply dying of age and grief. She didn't accept that. She investigated, she tested, she documented. She refused to let evil succeed simply because it was clever. And when she'd saved her father and caught the killer, she didn't stop. She asked, how many others are being poisoned right now, undetected? How many deaths attributed to heart failure or stomach ailments are actually homicides? How can we catch these killers before they succeed? She spent her life answering those questions. She developed the tools, trained the people, created the systems that now protect us all. She was a scientist in the truest sense, someone who looked at the world, saw what was broken, and fixed it. We are all safer because Lorraine Ashcroft lived. That is the highest tribute any of us can hope for. The mourners, medical examiners, toxicologists, law enforcement officials, former students, stood in silence as they lowered her casket into the ground beside her family. Mother Dorothy, Brother Clayton, Father Wendell. Together again. On Lorraine's headstone, the epitaph she'd chosen herself. She sought the truth and found it. Her textbook, Forensic Detection of Metallic Poisons, remains in print today in its 6th edition, updated by her former students, still used in forensic pathology courses worldwide. In the preface to the first edition, Lorraine wrote, "This work was born from grief. In 1943, I lost my brother to murder and nearly lost my father. The weapon was poison. The motive was greed. The method was patience. The killer was someone we trusted, someone we loved. That betrayal taught me that evil is real, that it lives among us, that it wears a pleasant face. But that same experience taught me that truth is stronger than deception, that knowledge is stronger than cunning, that courage is stronger than fear. Evil succeeds only when good people accept the convenient lie. When we refuse to accept it, when we ask questions, gather evidence, demand proof, evil can be defeated." This book is dedicated to everyone who refuses to accept convenient lies, to the physicians who order one more test when something doesn't add up, to the laboratory technologists who double-check unexpected results, to the family members who trust their instincts when a loved one's illness doesn't make sense, to the investigators who pursue truth even when it leads somewhere uncomfortable. __quote_64__. In 2019, the University of Pittsburgh Medical School established the Lorraine Ashcroft Fellowship in Forensic Toxicology, a 2-year research position for recent PhD graduates. The fellowship supports investigation of emerging toxic threats and development of novel detection methods. Each year, the fellow presents the Ashcroft Memorial Lecture, discussing their research and its implications for public safety. The first Ashcroft Fellow, Dr. Sarah Chen, researched methods for detecting fentanyl analogs in post-mortem samples. In her memorial lecture, she said, "The case of Vera Kowalski Ashcroft is studied in criminology courses as a textbook example of the serial killer. A woman who marries for financial gain and eliminates spouses through slow poisoning. Criminologists note that such killers are often difficult to detect because their methods mimic natural death, and because domestic poisoning isn't usually suspected when the spouse appears devoted and caring. What made the Ashcroft case remarkable," wrote Dr. Margaret Sullivan in her book Women Who Kill: Patterns in Female Serial Homicide, was that it was solved not by police investigation, but by a victim's daughter using scientific methodology. Lorraine Ashcroft essentially invented the modern approach to detecting serial domestic poisoning. Before her work, such cases were almost never identified. After her work, they became solvable. She changed the equation between poisoners and their potential victims. The story of Lorraine Ashcroft teaches us several lessons. First, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, if a loved one's illness doesn't make medical sense, if their symptoms worsen only at home, if someone seems too controlling of their care, investigate. Don't dismiss your concerns as paranoia. Second, evidence matters. Lorraine didn't simply accuse her stepmother. She gathered proof. She documented, tested, consulted experts, built an airtight case. Emotion without evidence is just suspicion. Evidence transforms suspicion into justice. Third, expertise is a weapon against evil. Lorraine's scientific training gave her the tools to detect what others missed. Education, knowledge, technical skill. These aren't abstractions. They're shields against deception and swords against wrongdoing. Fourth, personal tragedy can become public good. Lorraine could have solved her family's case and stopped there. Instead, she spent 44 years ensuring other families wouldn't endure what hers had. She turned her pain into purpose. And finally, good can defeat evil. Vera was intelligent, patient, methodical, a nearly perfect killer. But Lorraine was more intelligent, more patient, more methodical. Vera used science to kill. Lorraine used science to save. Vera's cleverness was finite. Lorraine's determination was not. In the end, truth prevailed because someone refused to let it die. This is not a story about Vera Kowalski-Ashcroft, the poisoner who killed 3 men for insurance money. This is a story about Lorraine Ashcroft, the woman who stopped her, who refused to accept convenient explanations, who trusted science over sentiment, who transformed grief into knowledge and knowledge into salvation for others. Every year on the anniversary of Lorraine's death, students from the University of Pittsburgh Medical School's toxicology program place flowers at her grave in Homewood Cemetery. They've never met her, but they study her methods, read her papers, follow her example. They understand that forensic science is more than a career, it's a calling. A commitment to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them, to seek truth no matter how uncomfortable, to let evidence speak louder than emotion. Lorraine Ashcroft heard that calling in 1943 when she stood in a laboratory staring at spectral lines that proved her father was being murdered. She could have ignored it, convinced herself she was wrong, chosen the comfortable delusion over the terrible truth. But she didn't. She listened. She acted. She saved lives. Her legacy endures not in monuments or buildings named after her, but in the lives she saved, directly and indirectly. The poisoning victims whose deaths were correctly identified because physicians remembered her diagnostic criteria. The potential victims whose would-be killers were caught early because investigators used her detection protocols. The families spared the agony hers endured. That is the measure of a life well lived. Not fame or wealth, but lives saved, knowledge shared, evil defeated. Lorraine Ashcroft defeated evil, not with violence, not with vengeance, but with intelligence, courage, and an absolute commitment to truth. She proved that one person, armed with knowledge and determination, can stop a killer, save the innocent, and change the world. In the end, that's what matters. Not whether we suffer tragedy, we all do, but what we do with it. Whether we let it break us or forge us into something stronger. Whether we turn inward in bitterness or outward in service. Whether we accept evil's victory or fight until truth prevails. Lorraine chose to fight, and she won. And because she won, others lived. That is her monument. That is her immortality. Evil is real. It walks among us. It smiles, bakes pies, speaks kindly. It is patient, methodical, clever. But truth is stronger. If there is someone who refuses to surrender, who searches, who believes, truth wins. Lorraine Ashcroft was that someone. She sought the truth and found it. In finding it, she saved her father, stopped a killer, and lit a beacon for others to follow. The light still burns.